God is silent, and that is no coincidence. Right now, millions of Christians around the world are crying out, praying, pleading, and hearing only silence. Heaven seems closed. Tears are falling, but answers are not coming. But here's what few realize. God's silence is also a sign, and it's happening now just as prophesied. Today you will discover why this silence is not abandonment, but perhaps the most powerful sign God has ever given us. And in the end, you will understand that when God is silent, He may be shouting. Why is God silent when we need Him most? It's 3 a.m. You're on your knees, heartbroken, begging for an answer, anything, a sign, a word, a feeling. But all you hear is emptiness, the piercing silence that hurts more than any scream. Millions of people are living this today. Broken families pray for restoration. Sick people cry out for healing. Young people ask for direction. And heaven remains silent. But here's something that will shock you. This silence doesn't mean that God isn't listening. In fact, it can mean just the opposite. When God doesn't answer, it may be because He's up to something that our finite minds can't comprehend. God's silence is not cruelty, it is divine strategy, and you're about to understand why. Let me tell you the story of a man who knew this silence well. David was only 16 years old when Samuel anointed him king of Israel. Oil ran down his head, the Spirit of God came upon him, and everyone expected him to take the throne immediately. But that was not what happened. Instead of a palace, David was given a cave. Instead of subjects, he had to flee from King Saul as a criminal. For years, he wandered the desert with a band of desperate people, sleeping on the hard ground, eating whatever he could find. Where was God? Why the silence when David most needed divine confirmation? The Anointed One was living as a fugitive, and the heavens seemed like bronze. But God was not absent. He was carving the character of a king from the rough marble of a young shepherd boy. Every night in the wilderness, every persecution, every quiet moment was preparing David to lead a nation. The time of spiritual silence is not abandonment. It is preparation for something greater than we can imagine. But then, why does this silence hurt so much? God works like an artist in the dark. Imagine a sculptor working on a masterpiece in the wee hours of the morning. You don't see his hands moving, you don't hear the sound of his tools, but he's there, shaping every detail with surgical precision. This is how God works in our lives when He seems silent. While you feel like your prayers are being ignored, God is rearranging circumstances. While you think He has forgotten about you, He is preparing people to cross your path at just the right moment. God speaks in the silence, but in a language that our natural ears cannot capture. The prophet Elijah experienced this. After a spectacular victory on Mount Carmel, he fled in fear from Jezebel and hid in a cave. God did not come in a strong wind, nor in an earthquake, nor in fire. He came in a gentle, almost imperceptible breeze. Sometimes God whispers because He wants us to come closer and listen. Silence is not distance, it is an invitation to intimacy. But there are signs we are missing as we wait for audible answers. Before I continue, I need to take a quick break. If this content is touching your heart, please leave a like so I know you are connected with this message. And subscribe to the channel. I promise it will be quick, and this helps me a lot to continue bringing content that really matters to your spiritual life. Now, let's get back to the invisible spiritual signs that we ignore. How many times have we asked God for a great sign, an audible voice, a spectacular miracle, a vision, and missed the whispers He is already sending? An unexpected conversation that brings exactly the word we needed to hear. An opportunity that comes out of nowhere, an inexplicable peace in the midst of chaos. God speaks even in silence, but in a language different from our expectations. We expect thunder, but He sends dew. We expect earthquakes, but He changes our hearts one beat at a time. The problem is not that God isn't speaking. The problem is that we are tuned into the wrong frequency. Invisible spiritual signs are all around us, but our eyes are fixed on what we think we should see. What if God's silence is the clearest sign He has ever given us? The Bible is full of silences that preceded great moves of God. 400 years. That was the length of time God was silent between the last prophet of the Old Testament and the birth of John the Baptist. 4 centuries without a prophetic word, without visions, without supernatural manifestations. God's people lived for generations without hearing his voice. And then, John the Baptist cried out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." The silence was over because Jesus was coming. Jesus himself experienced the silence of the Father. In Gethsemane, he sweated blood, crying out for a way out, but the heavens remained silent. On the cross, he cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And there was no audible response. But that silence wasn't abandonment. It was the price that had to be paid so that we would never again be truly alone. God's silence in the Bible has always preceded his greatest acts. What if we are living in one of those times now? God's silence is like a spiritual X-ray. It reveals what's really inside us. When God doesn't answer immediately, what comes to the surface? Faith or despair, perseverance or rebellion, humility or wounded pride. Moments of spiritual testing are not for God to discover who we are. He already knows. They are for us to discover. Job went through this. He lost everything in one day and didn't understand why. His friends came with religious explanations. His wife suggested that he curse God, but Job chose a different answer. "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." God's silence revealed that Job's faith did not depend on God's blessings, but on God himself. And when God finally spoke, he did not explain away suffering. He revealed his greatness. God and human suffering go hand in a way that our minds cannot fully process. But our hearts can choose to trust even without understanding. What if this silence is more than a personal test? What if it is a sign for an entire generation? Here's a perspective that could change everything. What if the silence millions are experiencing today is not a coincidence, but a prophetic sign of the times we live in? The Bible speaks of periods when God would be silent, not out of absence, but as a warning to those with spiritual ears to hear. Amos 8:11 says, "The days will come when I will send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread or a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord." A collective spiritual famine, a silence that affects not just individuals, but entire nations. Signs from God in the end times include not only catastrophes and wars, but also periods of divine silence that precede great judgments or great revivals. God's silence in the last days may be his way of preparing us for what is coming. It is not absence, it is preparation for his final manifestation. The question is not whether God will speak again. The question is, when he speaks again, will we be ready to listen? Is God absent? This question echoes in the heart of every believer who has ever walked through a deep valley. Even Jesus, the Son of God, felt this. On the cross, in his humanity, he experienced the feeling of divine abandonment when he cried out, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?" If Jesus himself felt the absence of the Father, how can we find it strange to feel the same? Feeling the absence of God is not a lack of faith. It is part of the human experience in a fallen world. But here's the paradox. At the moment when Jesus felt most abandoned, he was performing the greatest act of love in history. His sense of abandonment ensured that we would never again be truly alone. Is God testing me? Perhaps. But every divine test has a purpose: to reveal our true faith and prepare us for greater responsibility. Sometimes God's absence is as powerful as his presence. Not all silence lasts forever. Hannah had been crying out for years for a son, and God seemed deaf to her tears. Even the priest thought she was drunk from praying in desperation. But her persistent faith pierced the silence of heaven, and she conceived Samuel, the prophet who would change Israel. Elijah prayed 7 times for rain before he saw a cloud the size of a hand. 7 times the sky remained closed. The 8th time, The floodgates of heaven opened. Blind Bartimaeus shouted so loudly that the crowd tried to silence him, but his persistence reached Jesus' ears, and he left that day able to see. God's silence is not an insurmountable wall. It is a door that can be opened by persistent faith. When God doesn't answer, perhaps it's because he wants to hear more from us. Not our cries of despair, but our declarations of faith. Sometimes God's silence is an answer. The answer is, keep crying out. Your faith is being forged. God's silence is not rejection. It is an invitation to deeper intimacy. Think about a human relationship. When you first meet, you talk non-stop, discovering each other. But as intimacy grows, the comfort of shared silence emerges. You can be together without having to speak because presence is enough. God invites us to this level of relationship, where we don't need spectacular signs to know that he is present, where silence is not emptiness but fullness, where we learn to rest in his presence without needing constant confirmation. What does God's silence mean? It could mean that he trusts our faith so much that he doesn't feel the need to give us signs at every step. It is a spiritual compliment, not a punishment. God is close even in silence. Closer than when he spoke audibly, because now he speaks directly to our spirit. If you have come this far, feeling the silence of God in your life, I want you to know something important. This silence is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of a new form of communication. God hasn't stopped speaking. He's changed languages. Instead of audible words, he uses circumstances. Instead of visions, he uses people. Instead of thunder, he uses whispers in your heart. God's silence in the last days may be one of the most powerful signs that something big is about to happen. Like the calm before the storm, God's silence may be preparing the world for his next great manifestation. Don't give up. Don't stop praying. Don't let the silence cool your faith. Instead, use this time to draw closer to him, to listen with your heart and not just with your ears. Because when God breaks that silence, and he will, you will understand that every second of waiting was worth it. God's silence is not the end of the story. It is preparation for the next chapter. If you are experiencing a moment of spiritual silence, I want you to reflect. What might God be preparing in your life during this time? What aspects of your character is he shaping while you don't see his hand moving? Leave a comment. Have you ever experienced a period of silence from God? What was that experience like? Your story may encourage someone who is going through the same situation right now. If this content touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share it with someone who needs to hear that God's silence can also be a sign of love, not abandonment. Remember, God is never as close as when he seems farthest away. His silence is not absence, it is preparation for something greater than you can imagine. And when he speaks again, you will understand that every moment of waiting was part of his perfect plan for your life. Keep holding on, keep praying, keep believing. God's silence today may be the prelude to his greatest miracle in your life tomorrow.